Fanboy, 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 fanboy. What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of Fanboy Reviews Countdown. And today we're going to talk about the top 10 worst handhelds of all time. Number 1. Gamecom. Alright, so the Gamecom was released by Tiger Electronics. Came out in 97, despite having features ahead of its time, such as touchscreen, the stylus, and internet connection via 14K modem. The Gamecom was a complete mess, and was every handheld enthusiast's nightmare. It had no backlight, which made the on-screen controls unbearable, unreliable backup battery, which basically erased the memory and the save data, had no third-party developed games, so basically it just relied on actual in-house developed titles, even the ones that were licensed. And it had arguably the worst ad campaign and marketing in gaming history, because basically it insulted the fans, and it lacked any important coverage and press. I mean, nobody really talked about it when it came out. It had no hype. The worst games for the Gamecom was Mortal Kombat, Duke Nukem, and Resident Evil. And, I mean, these were unknown franchises that weren't even popular in the 90s. I mean, nobody even knew about these games, so the Gamecom from Tiger Electronics was destined to flop. Number 2 was the Sega Game Gear. Came out in 1990. This was a crappy 8-bit handheld that was basically just a ripoff of the Sega Master System. That's right. Master System came out in the 80s, and Sega was so cheap that they even made it backward compatible to play the Sega Master System games, since, you know, the Game Gear's library was so lackluster and empty. It had a color backlit screen, but nothing really special, since Atari Lynx, which already came out way back in '89, already had a color LCD screen. Its biggest downfall were its incredibly short battery life, and flopped completely compared to the superior Nintendo Game Boy. And so the worst games were definitely Space Harrier, Sonic the Hedgehog, and Shinobi. Game Gear, an utter frickin' failure. Alright, coming in at number 3 was the Sony PSP. That's right, PlayStation Portable. Came out in 2004, one of the crappiest and poorly designed handhelds of all time. The PSP utterly failed to make any impact in portable gaming market. First of all, it used these outdated UMDs, which were universal media discs, instead of actual cartridges or the game cards, which, you know, the UMDs made the load time so horrendous to sit through. It was so slow and laggy. It also had this hackneyed, unoriginal library of games that can already be found on superior home consoles, the PS1, PS2, PS3. They were basically just cheap ports, and they were already, you know, inferior versions of the console games. And then you had the PSP exclusives that were just stupid offshoots and spin-offs from already existing games. It pretty much had no RPGs, no fighting games, no action games really, which, you know, Sony systems were usually known for. It also lacked proper analog controls for first-person shooters. So the PSP was an absolute mess, and the worst games were games like God of War, Ghost of Sparta, Tekken Dark Resurrection, and God of War Chains of Olympus. Alright, number 4 was the Game Boy Advance. Came out in 2001 from Nintendo. This was supposed to be the successor to Nintendo's original handheld, the Game Boy. And the GBA completely sucked from the day it was released. Unfortunately, Nintendrones ate it up and sold almost 17 million in Japan and over 40 million in the Americas. It had no backlight, which made the graphics horribly unrecognizable and hard to see. Its library was packed with crappy 2D gameplay and graphics that could have been released in 1992. I mean, they advertised it as, it's a 32-bit handheld, blah blah. But it's like, a freaking handheld Super Nintendo. How pathetic is that? GBA was a prime example of hype over substance. Nothing special or different that made it stand out from past handhelds. Worst games on GBA was Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire, the Mario Advance series, and Metroid Fusion. Alright, coming in at number 5 was a PS Vita. Came out in 2011. This was the 8th gen Sony handheld. Supposedly the successor to the PSP. This embarrassing disappointment of a handheld has been a flop from the beginning. The Vita's graphics sucks compared to the 3DS. The sound and the music output is terrible compared to the 3DS. The game library is obviously poor compared to the 3DS, and just an overall inferior sense of quality compared to the 3DS. Its battery life is so awful that they had to release a slimmer version with an extra hour of charge power, but definitely still not enough. There's even a crappy PS Vita TV, PlayStation Vita TV garbage that completely dismisses the actual handheld in favor of the television output to play the Vita game, so the Vita itself is on its way out. The worst games on the Vita is Killzone Mercenary, Persona 4 Golden, and PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale. Absolute turds. Alright, number 6, Neo Geo Pocket. Came out in 98. This was a horrible idea by SNK. The Neo Geo Pocket was discontinued just 1 year after release in 1999. It was also released only in limited Asian areas, including Japan, and it never even came out in the West. It was so poor and crappy that it's only sold 2 million, including the updated version, which was the Pocket Color, which basically just tried to rip off the Game Boy Color. They try to include, colors with the palette and the graphics, but it sucked too. Its biggest downfall was the lack of games. There was only like 80 games that came out. Most of them just ports, or just crappy versions of arcade and console games. Most of them were SNK, so, SNK sucked in the first place. Its worst games include King of Fighters, Metal Slug, and Samurai Showdown. Ugh. Alright, number 7 was the Atari Lynx. Came out in 89. This was released by Atari as their pathetic attempt of breaking the handheld market. The Atari Lynx completely stunk. No good games, no innovative features, and just tried to rip off the Sega Game Gear. That's right. Rips off the Game Gear with the color screen and everything, and the layout, the design. It was way too expensive. It was like $180 when it came out, and it was already discontinued by 1994. So it didn't have longevity. And it still used freaking ROM cartridges, which were completely outdated by the early 90s. Nothing special at all. It's very forgotten at this point, and the worst games for the Lynx was Stun Runner, Shanghai, and Klax. Never heard of them? That's right. Well, that's exactly why it failed. Alright, coming in at number 8. Number 8 is Nintendo 3DS. Came out in 2011. This was one of the worst handhelds ever made. The 3DS offered nothing new or fresh in the portable industry. Its style, the look, the 3D feature is just useless. It was boring, monotonous. Originally, it was way too expensive, at $250, which resulted in horrible sales. Nintendo was so desperate that they had to drop the price to $170 within just a few short months just to try and raise the sales. Of course, the poor idiots who can't afford the system initially took advantage of it, and now 3DS is like almost 35 million in sales. as of September 2013. I mean, it's a crappy handheld. It's far weaker than the PS Vita in terms of graphics, audio, and overall specs and capabilities. I mean, why'd you want to get a weaker system? I have no clue. The worst games, Kid Icarus, Pokemon X and Y, and Fire Emblem Awakening. Alright, number 9 is Nintendo DS. Oh my goodness, the DS stunk. Came out in 2004. First of all, what a stupid name. DS, really? The DS. So first it was, you know, the Game Boy Advance SP. Yeah, the SP, GBA SP. Which to this day, nobody knows what that means. And now Nintendo's using DS. Yeah, what's with these crappy initials all of a sudden, you know? I mean, we still don't even know what it stands for. You know, some people say developer system, others say dual screen, but make up your freaking mind. You know, what are you gonna call it? Plus, the DS had a crappy graphics. It was even worse than the N64. It had its cheap stylus thing, which just rips off the Gamecom, and then this corny touchscreen, which is just a gimmick. Pathetic Nintendo released so many versions of the DS that, you know, they had like the DS Lite, the DSi, the DSi XL. No wonder it sold over 150 million units, because they're so common and cheap. And of course, many people will just buy it instead of, you know, the more expensive and higher quality handhelds like the PSP 3000, the PSP Go, Gizmondo. I mean, these are way superior handhelds. The worst games for the DS were Legend of Zelda Phantom Hourglass, Pokemon Black and White, and Pokemon Diamond and Pearl. Ugh. Alright, coming in at number 10 is the Nintendo Game Boy. That's right, the original Game Boy came out in '89. Ugh. Where do I begin? This was the crappy 8-bit handheld that doesn't even have 3D graphics. You know, it's just a plain black and white, 2D sprites, you know, it already looks like turds. Very inferior system with limited capabilities, even compared to its contemporaries like the Game Gear and the Lynx, which came out around the same time. Had no backlight, no colors, doesn't even have internet connection or Wi-Fi. Like, this pile of poop doesn't even have internet? You can't even hook it up online and play Mortal Kombat or Street Fighter? Go against other people all over the world? What kind of crap is that? Imagine how amazing like some of these games would have been if you can actually connect with other people, but of course, frickin' Nintendo is so technologically behind that they don't even implement these features until it's too late. Game Boy frickin' sucked. Oh, by the way, if the black and white screen, you know, the LCD that had no colors, if that was so good, how come games today aren't black and white anymore? I thought so. You pathetic little nerds. Alright, and the worst games that came out is Tetris, Pokemon Red and Blue, and Yellow for that matter. I mean, that was a pile of turds. And Super Mario Land. Alright. So that's it for the top 10 worst handheld systems of all time. Portable gaming's crappiest platforms ever made, and remember, handheld gaming stinks compared to consoles, and if you don't have a console but you own handhelds, or even if you just play more handheld games than consoles, you are not a gamer. You're a complete freaking loser.